Welcome Mito, boring history for sleep. Here, you'll find no battles, no kings, and no great dramas. Instead, we wander through the small, quiet corners of the past, the places where ordinary people lived, worked, and endured. Think of this as a slow journey through time, where every detail is given space. From the creak of a wooden loom to the smoke rising from a turf-roofed farmhouse, let the steady rhythm of old, forgotten lives carry you into rest. And remember, history isn't always exciting, but it is always there, patiently waiting. Now, let us begin. You are standing, if only in imagination, in a small village in medieval Europe. The year could be 1327 or 1481. It hardly matters, because the lives of peasants changed so little over the centuries. The roofs above their cottages are thatched, low, and heavy with frost. Smoke curls lazily from holes cut crudely into rooftops. 4 chimneys are still rare in the poorer homes. The sun has set hours ago, and the air is heavy with the sharp sting of frost, the kind that makes your nose ache and your eyelashes stiffen. The coldest nights were not unusual in northern Europe. The winters pressed down on the land with a quiet, persistent cruelty, and yet, year after year, peasants endured them with a mix of preparation, ritual, and sheer bodily endurance. Their strategies were rarely elegant, but they were effective, enough to keep most of them alive until the thaw. The question for the ordinary peasant was not whether winter would be hard. It always was, but rather whether they could stretch their limited resources until spring. Food, warmth, and shelter formed the triad of survival. Each element demanded careful attention, months in advance. During the warmer seasons, food before fire. Winter survival began with food, often months earlier. In summer and autumn, peasants dried beans, stored cabbages in cool pits dug beneath their cottages, salted fish if they were lucky enough to live near rivers, and prepared hard rye bread that could last for months. Nothing went to waste. Even the smallest scraps of meat could be boiled into broths, the grease saved in clay pots to be reused. Grain was the lifeline, but grain spoiled easily if not stored in dry, vermin-free places. Rats, mice, and damp were as dangerous as frost itself. To walk into a peasant's cottage in December was to smell cabbage, onions, and smoke, mingled with the earthy scent of stored root vegetables buried beneath straw. But food was only one part of the struggle. A full stomach might keep strength, but it could not alone keep out the deep cold that crept into bones during long nights. The architecture of warmth peasant cottages were simple, and in winter, simplicity had both strengths and weaknesses. Thick mud walls insulated against the wind, but roofs leaked and drafts were constant. Windows were rare and often sealed with oiled cloth or animal bladder rather than glass, which was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. Inside, a central hearth was the main source of heat. This was little more than a fire built upon a flat patch of earth, the smoke rising uncertainly toward a hole in the ceiling. The smoke-stained rafters, black-coated lungs with soot and often irritated eyes. Yet, in its way, it preserved the thatch above, keeping away insects and slowing decay. Firewood was precious. Gathering enough to last through a medieval winter required weeks of labor. Peasants collected fallen branches, cut peat from bogs, or in treeless areas, dried dung for burning. This work was unglamorous, dull, and exhausting, but entirely necessary. Without fuel, the fire would die, and with it, the chance of survival at night. When wood supplies had to be conserved, fires were allowed to dwindle. Families relied on body heat, shared bedding, and layers of straw spread across floors to keep out the chill rising from the ground. Straw was more than bedding. It was insulation, changed often to keep down lice and vermin. Sleeping arrangements. To imagine the medieval peasant bed is to forget the solitary comfort of modern sleep. Families often slept together in one large bed or in several pallets arranged around the central fire. Privacy was unknown, but warmth was everything. Infants were tucked tightly between parents, older children huddled together, and the elderly positioned nearest to the fire. It was a practical arrangement, dictated by the body's natural heat. The bedding was simple: woolen blankets, if the household owned sheep, rough linen sheets, or, more often, just layers of straw and animal skins. Quilts were a luxury, and feathers, though used by some wealthier peasants, were rare. A household without wool had to make do with coarse fabrics, heavy cloaks, or even sacks stuffed with straw. Sleep itself came early. With darkness falling in the late afternoon and candles expensive to make or buy, peasants followed the rhythm of the sun. Long winter nights were divided into first sleep and second sleep, with a waking period in between where families might talk quietly, tend the fire, or say prayers. This segmented pattern of sleep was normal, and it made the long hours of darkness more bearable. Clothing against the cold then. Peasants' clothing was as much a tool of survival as the fire. Wool was the most common fabric, spun at home and woven into thick garments. Outer tunics were often layered, with under tunics of linen where possible. Cloaks, fastened with simple wooden or metal brooches, added another layer. Footwear was a constant struggle. Shoes of leather were expensive, and not every peasant owned a pair. Many wore simple boots stuffed with straw for insulation. Gloves were rare. Hands were warmed instead by pulling long sleeves over them or simply by working constantly. The cold crept in regardless, but the multiple layers created a cocoon of warmth, and wool, though scratchy, trapped heat effectively. The image of the medieval peasant wrapped in rough, patched garments is accurate, but those patches often meant the difference between warmth and frostbite, the night sounds of a frozen village step outside that cottage. If only in your imagination. The night is utterly dark, save for the faint glow of lanterns or the firelight seeping through cracks in shutters. The village is silent, but for the occasional bark of a dog, the creak of frost settling into wooden beams, or the muffled cough of a neighbor, the cold presses down with such force that it seems the whole world is holding its breath in that silence. Survival is a communal effort. Families help one another, sharing extra fuel or food when possible, for everyone knows that the winter spares no one. And yet, beneath the hardship, there is a rhythm. The peasants expect the cold. They live with it year after year, shaping their homes, habits, and very bodies to endure. And so the question remains, for peasants who lived in such relentless winters, with such limited means, what happened when the cold grew harsher than usual, when the fuel ran short, when crops failed, when snow lingered longer than expected? How did they stretch the fragile resources of life beyond their natural limits. You may imagine, again, the small village in its frozen landscape. The roofs remain frosted, the earth is hard as stone, and the air is so sharp that breath seems to hang in clouds. By this point in winter, often January or February, the earliest stores of food are dwindling. The firewood pile shrinks daily. It is in these leanest months that the true ingenuity and suffering of peasant survival is most clearly seen. Hunger was not a rare visitor in the medieval winter. It was a steady companion. Even in good years, families counted carefully, rationing each handful of grain or dried beans. Bread grew coarser as the months went on, mixed with barley or oats rather than pure wheat. Sometimes even the husks of grain or ground-up acorns were added to stretch supplies. These made the bread filling, but not always nourishing. Soups and pottages became the main meals. A pot hung over the hearth could simmer for hours. Fed with whatever scraps were available: onions, leeks, cabbage leaves, dried peas, or salted bits of meat. Families dipped bread into the broth to soften it, eating slowly, prolonging the sense of fullness. It was not a feast. It was maintenance of life. The poorest, when food ran out entirely, sought substitutes: bark ground into flour, nettles boiled as greens, or roots dug from frozen earth. None of these were ideal, but they kept starvation at bay. Survival was never purely individual. Villagers leaned on one another, not from generosity alone, but because mutual aid was necessary. When a family ran low on firewood, neighbors might share. If one household had a cow producing milk, a portion could be exchanged for labor or goods. These exchanges were not always equal, but they reinforced bonds of obligation that helped the village as a whole endure the season. The church played a role as well. Parish priests encouraged charity, especially during the Christmas season. Alms for the poor often meant bread or grain was distributed, though supplies were never abundant. Monasteries, where nearby, were sometimes more reliable sources of food relief, storing larger reserves and offering meals to beggars or travelers. Yet even monasteries could not escape the pinch of a harsh winter. A dwindling woodpile was as terrifying as an empty grain sack. Fire meant more than warm-fit, dried, damp clothes, preserved tools, and allowed food to be cooked safely. Without fuel, families risked not only frostbite but also sickness. Peasants used every available source of fuel. Peat, cut in autumn and dried in stacks, was common in boggy regions. Dried dung from cattle was pressed into cakes and burned, giving off a distinct smell but steady heat. Twigs, brush, and even old thatch or broken furniture could be fed into the flames when desperation struck. Sometimes families practiced what was called a banked fire at night. Rather than letting flames die, they buried hot embers beneath ash. In the morning, these could be uncovered and rekindled with a few twigs, saving both time and scarce kindling. This small act of preservation often marked the line between warmth and shivering misery. Winter was a season of sickness. The close, smoky air inside cottages aggravated lungs. Damp straw bedding encouraged fevers. Malnutrition weakened bodies. Diseases like pneumonia, influenza-like fevers, or simple respiratory infections could be fatal. Medical care was rudimentary. Remedies often consisted of herbal teas, poultices of onion or garlic, or prayers whispered over the sick. For peasants, survival through illness relied heavily on natural resilience and the care of family members. The cold made every sickness worse, lengthening recovery and often leading to lingering weakness. The churchyards tell the quiet truth. More graves were dug in late winter and early spring than at any other time of year, though fields lay fallow and snow blanketed the ground. Peasants were never idle. Winter brought different tasks: repairing tools, mending clothes, spinning wool, and weaving cloth. Animals had to be fed and sheltered. Sheep and goats provided milk, chickens their eggs, though fewer in number during cold months. Men and women alike contributed. Children helped gather sticks or tend fires. Elderly members often took on the quiet labor of spinning or watching young children, freeing younger bodies for heavier tasks. It is tempting to imagine winter as a time of rest, but for peasants, it was a season of constant calculation: which food to eat now, which to save, whether to burn another log or endure the chill. Each choice carried consequences that might echo weeks later. The church calendar offered structure in an otherwise bleak season. Feast days like Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas brought moments of light into the darkness. These were occasions for gatherings, shared meals, and sometimes small gifts of food or drink. Religious observance also provided a way to interpret suffering. Cold and hunger were not only physical hardships, but tests of faith. Enduring them patiently was seen as a form of piety, while charity to neighbors offered spiritual reward. In this way, the rhythms of prayer and ritual provided a kind of mental insulation against despair. Yet, some winters pressed harder than others. A poor harvest meant stores were insufficient. Floods or early frosts could ruin crops. In these years, famine hovered at the edge of every village. People sold belongings, borrowed heavily, or migrated in search of food. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, caused by relentless rain and crop failure, showed how fragile survival could be. Even peasants, accustomed to scarcity, found themselves starving. Reports from the time describe desperate measures: eating horses, dogs, or even, in whispered rumors, the flesh of the dead. Such extremes were rare, but they left deep scars on cultural memory. In ordinary winters, peasants survived with difficulty. In extraordinary winters, survival itself was uncertain. Imagine again the family huddled around a fading fire. The pot on the hearth holds a thin soup stretched with water. A child coughs, wrapped in a wool cloak patched too many times. The father counts the wood left in the pile, knowing it will not last until spring unless they ration carefully. The mother checks the sacks of grain, each handful weighed against the uncertain length of the season. These nights were long, not only in hours, but in worry. The cold pressed against the walls, but the heavier burden was the unending question: would the resources hold? Could they stretch food, fuel, and strength until the thaw? And so the quiet question lingers. When survival was reduced to the barest essentials, what moments of comforts small, fragile, and fleeting dead peasants create for themselves to soften the hardship of winter? The story of medieval winter is not only one of hardship, It is also a story of small comforts, fragile, ordinary things that offered warmth of body and spirit in the coldest months. For all their struggles, peasants found ways to endure, not simply through labor and rationing, but through moments of rest, companionship, and the promise of seasons turning. The hearth was more than a source of fire. It was the heart of the cottage, the gathering place where daily life unfolded. In the evenings, when outdoor work was impossible, families drew close to its glow. Stories were told, folk tales, memories of ancestors, or recitations of prayers. The flickering firelight softened the roughness of the walls and beams, giving the room a sense of intimacy. Children dozed while elders whispered advice. Tools were mended in the glow, clothes patched, wool spun. The fire itself was both necessity and symbol. As long as it burned, life continued. The peasant's relationship with fire was one of constant care and reverence, almost like tending a living being. Even the simplest meals could bring comfort when shared in company. On feast days, or rare fortunate occasions, richer foods brightened the monotony. A piece of pork, a jug of ale, honey cakes at Christmastide. Ale, brewed at home, was more than refreshment. It was a safer drink than water, and a mild source of warmth and cheer in some regions. Spiced drinks were prepared during midwinter festivals, stretching what little luxury the household could afford. A warm drink by the fire could soften the edge of hunger, offering not only calories but comfort. Villages were tightly knit by necessity. Winter deepened these ties. Neighbors visited one another, not only for help but for companionship. Shared tasks, slaughtering a pig, brewing ale, spinning wool, were often done in groups, turning labor into social gatherings. Customs, like wasp, where villagers moved from house to house, singing and sharing drink, were not just festive. They reinforced community solidarity. Every shared loaf of bread or cup of ale meant another link of survival in a chain that stretched across the village. Religion shaped the way peasants interpreted winter. Candlemas, in early February, for instance, marked both the blessing of candles and a subtle turning point toward spring. These rituals reassured villagers that the darkness was temporary, part of a divine cycle. Prayers for warmth, blessings on hearths, and church gatherings gave meaning to endurance. Even in suffering, peasants found dignity in believing their hardships were not meaningless, but part of God's will. This faith was itself a form of warmth, giving structure and hope to lives lived on the edge of survival. Not all winter nights were solemn. Simple entertainments brightened long evenings. Instruments such as flutes, fiddles, or drums might be played in wealthier cottages. More often, music was sung by voice alone. Songs told stories of heroes, saints, or humorous misadventures. Games, dice, knucklebones, riddles filled the hours. Children invented play with sticks or scraps, their laughter rising above the cold. These moments of joy, though fleeting, offered relief from worry and gave the season a rhythm. Beyond hunger and cold, the length of winter was felt most keenly in the waiting. Every sign of change was noted: the slow return of light after the solstice, the first dripping of ice from roofs, the faint green tips of shoots in thawing soil by March or April. Even before the true warmth arrived, there was a perceptible shift. Days grew longer. The firewood pile, once threateningly low, could be allowed to burn more freely, as the worst had passed. The relief was not loud or celebratory. Life, once again, had endured to modern eyes. The peasant's winter appears almost unbearable. Smoke-filled cottages, hunger, sickness, the constant threat of running short. Yet within that struggle lay a deep resilience. They lived not with comfort, but with enough. Each winter that passed proved the strength of ordinary endurance. Their survival strategies were humble, saving scraps, layering straw, sharing warmth, praying through the night. But in their very simplicity, they reveal the heart of medieval life. It was not grand castles or heroic battles that sustained communities, but the quiet labor of keeping fire alive, rationing food, and leaning on neighbors. When you think of history, you may think of kings, wars, and great events. Yet the true story of humanity lies as much in these silent winters as in any throne room. It lies in the patience of families who endured cold after cold, century after century, shaping traditions of community, resilience, and hope. And perhaps, when you feel the chill of winter in your own life, you may hear the quiet echo of their endurance of peasants who, with little more than fire, wool, and one another, survived the coldest nights. Imagine yourself standing on a dusty road outside Rome in the late 1st century CE. Ahead of you stretches a line of arches, massive stone structures that march steadily across the landscape. Water trickles, unseen, inside stone channels lined with mortar. This is an aqueduct, a hidden lifeline of the Roman world. When you think of aqueducts, perhaps you picture grand architecture, noble arches silhouetted against the sky. Yet for the Romans themselves, these were not merely monuments. They were infrastructure, boring, vital, and in constant need of attention. For the citizens of Rome, nearly 1 million people, at the empire's height, the aqueducts meant survival. Without them, the fountains, baths, latrines, and households of the city would fall into crisis within days. But building an aqueduct was only the beginning of its story. The true challenge was maintenance, the slow, unending work of keeping water flowing cleanly and reliably over decades, even centuries. The earliest Romans drew their water from the Tiber River, wells, and springs. But as the city expanded, these sources grew inadequate. The first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was built in 312 BCE under the censor Appius Claudius Caecus. It ran mostly underground, less vulnerable to attack. Over the centuries, new aqueducts followed: Aqua Agno Vitae, Aqua Marcia, Aqua Claudia, and others, each capturing water from distant hills and guiding it into the city. By the late empire, Rome boasted 11 aqueducts spanning hundreds of kilometers combined. Together, they supplied an astonishing volume of water. Estimates suggest over 200 million gallons per day at peak capacity. Yet volume alone was not enough. Keeping that flow steady required constant vigilance. Roman aqueducts were feats of engineering designed for durability. They relied on gravity, with channels sloping gently, sometimes only a few inches per mile. Stone, brick, and concrete formed the structures. Inside, channels were lined with waterproof mortar called opus signinum. Bridges and arcades carried water across valleys, while tunnels pierced hills. Siphons of lead pipes managed drops in terrain. Settling tanks removed sediment before the water entered the city. The elegance of the design lay not in complexity, but in its steady reliability. Yet no material is eternal. Mortar cracked, lime deposits clogged channels, and roots intruded. Every storm, every shift of earth, every careless act of a farmer plowing too close risked disruption. The Romans employed a specialized workforce to maintain this system. At the top was the curator aquarum, an official appointed by the emperor, often of senatorial rank. Beneath him worked teams of slaves, freedmen, and hired laborers, known as aquarians. Their work was unglamorous but crucial. The equerri patrolled the lines, inspecting channels for leaks, cracks, or blockages. They cleared debris, scraped away mineral deposits, and patched mortar. They kept records, noting water flow and reporting irregularities. In a city where water meant not just drinking, but hygiene, industry, and public order, their diligence kept life flowing as surely as the aqueducts themselves. Once water reached Rome, it entered massive storage reservoirs called castellum aquae. From there, it was distributed through lead or terracotta pipes to fountains, baths, and private houses of the wealthy. Public fountains were the main access for ordinary citizens. Maintenance extended into the city as well. Pipes corroded, joints leaked, and illegal taps citizens, secretly drilling into conduits, had to be discovered and repaired. Inspectors walked the streets, checking connections, ensuring fair distribution, and guarding against theft. For the Romans, the aqueducts were not only about quantity, but quality. Springs high in the hills offered purer water than the Tiber, which was polluted by sewage and refuse. Still, keeping aqueduct water clean was a constant battle. Sediment settled in tanks, algae grew in channels, and animals sometimes fell into open conduits. The equerri had to ensure that water remained fit for use. Their scraping of lime deposits, cleaning of settling tanks, and repair of coverings were all essential. A lapse in maintenance could mean illness in crowded districts of the city. The citizens of Rome likely gave little thought to the men maintaining their water supply, just as modern city dwellers rarely think of those who keep electricity flowing or drains unblocked. Yet these unseen laborers shaped daily life. The baths depended on them, as did the fountains where women filled jars, and the latrines where waste was flushed away. Every amphitheater spectacle, every temple ritual requiring clean water, every domestic kitchen relied on this steady, silent flow. Rome's grandeur, so often celebrated in marble and politics, rested equally on the muddy, repetitive work of men keeping mortar patched and channels clear. So the aqueducts carried water, and the equerri kept them alive. But what happened when the system faltered, when neglect, disaster, or simple overuse caused Rome's water supply to fail? How did the empire respond when its lifelines cracked? Imagine again the long line of arches stretching across a Roman valley. From a distance, they seem permanent, solid, eternal. Yet walk closer, and you notice cracks in the stone, leaks darkening the mortar, white crusts of lime where water has seeped through. The truth is that the aqueducts, for all their grandeur, were fragile. They required constant care, and whenever care faltered, Rome felt the consequences. Water itself is a destroyer. Even as it sustained the city, it eroded mortar and stone. Calcium deposits stick, chalky layers, known as travertine, accumulated on channel walls. Left unchecked, these narrowed conduits slowing the flow. Roots from trees split masonry. Earthquakes, common in parts of the empire, cracked bridges and tunnels. Heavy rains washed away soil beneath foundations, destabilizing arches. A single broken section could disrupt miles of channel. The slope of aqueducts was so precise that even a minor collapse might require major rebuilding. Repairs were constant, repetitive, and often tedious. The aquarii were not glamorous figures of history. They worked in mud, smoke, and darkness. Clearing blockages meant crawling into channels with scraping tools, chiseling away mineral crusts, and hauling debris out by hand. In summer heat or winter chill, they patched mortar, carried stones, and dug trenches. Sometimes they worked at dizzying heights, climbing scaffolds to repair arches. Other times they descended into foul-smelling, settling tanks, shoveling out layers of silt. Their work was unending, for the water never stopped flowing, and neither did the decay. These men were often slaves or freedmen, bound to their duties. Their names rarely appear in history. Yet their hands shaped the daily life of the empire more than many senators. Not all problems were natural. Human hands often meddled with the system. Illegal taps were common. Citizens drilled small holes into conduits, siphoning water into private gardens or workshops. Wealthy households sometimes bribed workers to install secret pipes, diverting more than their fair share. This theft strained the system. Pressure dropped, fountains dried, and public resentment grew. To counter this, inspectors patrolled, searching for hidden pipes. Laws were passed forbidding tampering, but enforcement was uneven. The temptation of water in a dry climate was powerful, and corruption among workers meant many thefts went unpunished. At times, failures became city-wide crises. One account tells of aqueduct arches collapsing after heavy rains, cutting off supply to a district. Baths closed, fountains ran dry, and tempers flared. Crowds complained in the forum. Senators petitioned for urgent repairs. The curator aquarium, the official responsible for water, faced immense pressure in such moments. Money had to be raised, laborers conscripted, materials hauled from quarries. The disruption revealed how dependent Rome was on its lifelines. Without flowing water, the image of the eternal city faltered. Emperors understood the importance of water. Augustus, who reorganized Rome's aqueduct administration, appointed a permanent staff of hundreds under the curator aquarum. Claudius, who built the Aqua Claudia and Anio Novus, invested heavily in new construction to relieve shortages. Inscriptions record emperors boasting of repairs as much as of new works. Restoring water was a political act, proof of imperial care for the people. A repaired aqueduct was not only a practical improvement, but a symbol of stability. The empire could endure so long as its fountains flowed. Rome was not the only city with aqueducts. Across the empire from Gaul to North Africa, smaller cities built their own systems. These, too, required constant upkeep. Local councils bore responsibility, levying taxes or assigning citizens to oversee repairs. In provincial towns, resources were scarcer. Some aqueducts fell into disrepair, forcing citizens back to wells and cisterns. Others were carefully maintained for centuries, evidence of the pride and persistence of local communities. The story of aqueduct maintenance was thus not only Roman but imperial. woven into the daily lives of countless towns. Behind every flowing fountain stood labor unseen, quarrymen cutting stone, masons mixing mortar, carpenters erecting scaffolds, slaves hauling debris. The cost in labor and coin was immense. Rome poured wealth into its aqueducts, not only to build but to sustain them. This investment paid off in health, order, and prestige. Yet it was also a burden. Taxes supported repairs, and when revenues fell during wars, plagues, or economic decline, maintenance suffered. The lifelines frayed, and the city strained to adapt. Imagine yourself as one of those workers, standing ankle-deep in cold water inside a tunnel, torchlight flickering against damp stone. The air is heavy, the work endless. Outside, citizens drink freely from fountains, scarcely aware of your labor. You scrape lime from the walls, knowing it will return. You patch mortar, knowing it will crack again. The aqueduct is never finished. It lives only through your continual care. And so we must ask, when the empire's strength faltered in later centuries, when money dwindled and order collapsed, what became of these lifelines? Did the aqueducts continue to flow, or did Rome's water finally dry up along with its empire? Picture the aqueducts again, not in their prime, but in their slow fading. The arches still stand, but grass grows between the stones. Channels once full of rushing water now carry only trickles. In some places, the mortar has crumbled away, leaving gaps through which wind whistles. The lifelines of Rome, so carefully maintained for centuries, eventually faced neglect. The Roman Empire, at its height, had the resources to keep aqueducts alive. Taxes flowed from provinces, labor could be conscripted, and emperors had political incentive to provide for the city. But as the empire faced wars on multiple frontiers, plagues, and economic troubles, priorities shifted. Money once dedicated to public works was diverted to armies and fortifications. The bureaucracy of water, once a model of organization, weakened. Curators' aquarum had less authority, fewer resources, and sometimes less interest in their duties. Equerry and laborers still worked, but their numbers dwindled, and wages often went unpaid. The lifelines strained under the weight of imperial decline. Waterways were not only fragile. By nature, they were vulnerable in war. During sieges, enemies sometimes cut or poisoned aqueducts, forcing cities to rely on wells and cisterns. In 537 CE, during the Gothic Wars, Vitiges ordered the destruction of aqueducts supplying Rome. The city, by then no longer capital of empire, struggled to endure. Baths closed, fountains dried, and people scavenged for water in the Tiber once again. What had once been a symbol of Rome's mastery over nature became a weakness, exposed lines that could be severed by determined enemies. Even as aqueducts faltered, Romans adapted. Wells and cisterns regained importance. Rainwater collection, once secondary, became primary. Wealthy households dug deep shafts for groundwater. Public reliance shifted, not by choice, but by necessity. Bath culture, once the pride of the city, declined. Without steady water, great complexes like the baths of Heracleion stood half-empty, their halls echoing with memories rather than voices. Public hygiene worsened, and with it, health. The city survived, but on diminished terms. The grandeur of flowing fountains gave way to buckets drawn from dark wells. By the early Middle Ages, many aqueducts were abandoned. Some arches collapsed entirely, others remained as silent monuments. Local farmers quarried stone from aqueduct bridges for new buildings. Channels once alive with flow became pathways for goats or resting places for birds. Travelers in later centuries marveled at the ruins, describing them as giant skeletons stretched across the land. To them, these arches spoke of a lost greatness, a reminder that no empire, however powerful, could keep its lifelines flowing forever. Yet not all aqueducts vanished. Some remained in partial use, patched by local rulers or communities. In places like Gaul and Spain, aqueducts served medieval towns well into later centuries. The knowledge of Roman engineering lingered, even if in fragments, in Rome itself. The papacy revived portions of aqueducts in the Renaissance, repairing channels to bring fresh water once again to fountains and churches. The Aqua Virgo, built in 19 BCE, still delivers water to the Trevi Fountain today, a living thread connecting modern Rome to its ancient past. The Roman aqueducts remind us of a truth both humble and grand. Civilization rests on infrastructure. Roads, sewers, and water channels may seem dull compared to battles or emperors, yet they shape daily life far more deeply. Rome's aqueducts were not simply feats of engineering, flowing silently through centuries. Their maintenance, performed by unnamed laborers with chisels and mortar, was the foundation of the city's splendor. When maintenance faltered, so did the splendor. When you drink from a tap today, when you shower or flush a toilet, you are closer to the Romans than you might think. Your water, too, flows through channels that require endless, often invisible work. The legacy of the aqueducts is not only in ruined arches, but in the reminder that infrastructure, however boring, is the heartbeat of civilization. Rome's fountains may have dried, its baths fallen silent, but its lesson endures. The greatness of an empire or a city lies not only in monuments, but in the steady, unnoticed labor of keeping water flowing. Imagine the Great Wall of China, stretching like a dragon's spine across mountains and valleys. You may picture soldiers standing watch, scanning the horizon for invading armies. But behind those soldiers stood a quiet army of keepersmen whose jobs were not glorious, not heroic, but absolutely essential. They kept the wall standing, its watchtowers manned, its stones intact. Their lives were often forgotten, hidden beneath the legend of the wall itself. The Great Wall was not a single wall built once and left untouched. It was a patchwork of fortifications, constructed, repaired, and rebuilt over centuries, especially under the Qin, Han, and Ming dynasties. Harsh weather, erosion, and sheer time were constant enemies. To keep the wall standing required an ongoing workforce: brickmakers, lime burners, mortar mixers, masons, and mule drivers hauling materials to impossible heights. But once the wall was built, its life was far from over. The keepers had to live there, season after season, keeping watch not only against armies, but against the slow decay of wind, rain, and snow. A typical day for a wall-keeper began before dawn. At a garrison post, men rose stiff from thin bedding, rubbing frost from their beards in winter or swatting flies in summer. Food was simple, a millet porridge, sometimes with pickled vegetables, if supplies had arrived on time. Then came inspection of the wall. Every morning, teams checked the surface of the ramparts for loose stones. If bricks had shifted overnight, they hammered them back into place with crude iron tools. They swept away snow in winter, fearing that ice might crack mortar. In spring, they patched eroded slopes with packed earth. The work was repetitive and often thankless, yet without it, the wall would crumble. Of course, the keepers were also guards. They stood at the parapets, scanning far distances. But watching was not the dramatic act one might imagine. Most days brought nothing, only endless sky, rolling hills, and perhaps a shepherd's flock moving slowly in the distance. The boredom was heavy, and so keepers invented small ways to pass time whittling bits of wood, muttering songs, or carving their names into bricks. They also watched the smoke signals. If a distant beacon tower sent up smoke, they had to replicate it, spreading the signal down the line. In this way, a warning could travel hundreds of kilometers within hours. But in a year, many towers might never light a fire at all. The wall keepers depended on supply routes to bring food, tools, and clothing. These routes were long and treacherous. Mule trains struggled up mountains, and rivers flooded, delaying shipments. At times, keepers went weeks with little more than coarse bread and dried beans. Salt was precious, and when it ran short, even simple meals became difficult. Some posts were so remote that families of keepers grew small gardens or kept goats for milk. These were lifelines, but they could not replace the steady flow of state supplies. Shortages were common, and hunger was a familiar companion. The wall keepers lived through extremes. In summer, the stone ramparts baked under a relentless sun, burning hands that touched them. In winter, icy winds howled through cracks, numbing fingers, and freezing water buckets solid overnight. Men huddled in watchtowers with smoky fires, coughing from the poor air. But grateful for the warmth, spring brought rainstorms that washed away sections of earthworks, while autumn carried dust storms that scoured faces raw. Through all of it, the keepers remained bound, not by glory, but by duty. Yet even in this hard life, there were small comforts. Letters from home were cherished, though they often took months to arrive. Festivals, even far from villages, were marked with modest celebrations, a shared jar of wine, a small firecracker if available, or a carved charm hung on the wall for good fortune. Some keepers carved tiny shrines into the stones, leaving offerings of grain or coins for protective spirits. In the vast emptiness of the frontier, these shrines were companions as much as gods. The Great Wall itself remains one of history's most famous monuments, but the men who lived on it, who patched its cracks and endured its isolation, are mostly forgotten. Their names do not appear in chronicles, and their graves are unmarked. Yet without them, the wall would have been a ruin long before it became a legend. They were ordinary men, bound by conscription or poverty, who spent their best years watching an empty horizon and holding back not only enemies, but the slow erosion of time. When you think of the Great Wall, now, do you imagine the stones? Or do you imagine the men who touched them every day? Can a monument truly exist without those who labored in obscurity to preserve it? The Great Wall, though often imagined as a single barrier stretching across northern China, was also a living system of garrisons, watchtowers, and communities. Where there were keepers, there had to be organization. Life along the wall was not only about patching stones and standing watch, was also about rules, routines, and the slow rhythm of survival. During the Ming Dynasty, when the wall reached its most developed form, the empire divided the frontier into 9 great military regions, known as the 9 border garrisons. Each was commanded by generals who oversaw not just soldiers, but also the keepers, laborers, and their families who made the wall livable. Within these regions, the wall was divided further into zones. Each zone had its chain of command, from the general down to captains and sergeants, who kept records of supplies and assigned tasks. On paper, it was a tidy system, with ledgers, quotas, and inspections. In practice, the distance, weather, and sheer size of the wall often made the system creak under its own weight. Routines were central to survival. At dawn, a drum or horn summoned men to their posts. The morning began with inspection of weapons and armor, followed by a sweep of the wall itself. Each watchtower had a roster. Men rotated in pairs, standing at the parapet for hours before being relieved. Meanwhile, others tended to animals, repaired equipment, or fetched water from distant wells. In many garrisons, part of the day was devoted to farming. Soldiers and keepers alike cultivated millet, beans, and cabbage in nearby plots. The Ming state often granted land to frontier garrisons, believing that self-sufficiency would ease the burden on supply routes. These fields, clinging to rocky soil, were as important to survival as the wall itself. Evenings brought more inspections. Fires were lit in braziers for warmth and light, though wood was scarce and often rationed. Finally, night watches were assigned, with men rotating through until dawn. Sleep was shallow, broken by cold and by the knowledge that duty could call at any hour. Not all wall-keepers lived alone. Over time, garrisons attracted families. Soldiers brought wives and children, either officially sanctioned or in defiance of regulations. Small hamlets grew near fortresses, with markets where traders sold salt, cloth, and dried fish. Children played among the stones of the wall, chasing one another under the shadow of towers. For women, life was harsh. They carried water, spun thread, and helped tend fields, often while raising children alone when their husbands were on long patrols. Yet their presence gave the wall a fragile sense of community. In barren landscapes, even the smallest gatherings of homes became anchors of human warmth. The Ming bureaucracy was meticulous in its paperwork. Every tool issued to a keeper: an iron hammer, a spade, a basket for lime was recorded. Each sack of grain, each jar of oil, each bolt of cloth was noted in registers. Inspections were frequent. Officials from central government occasionally traveled the frontier, reviewing ledgers and walking the wall. They demanded evidence that the keepers had performed repairs, that towers were stocked with fuel and food, that soldiers could light beacon fires at a moment's notice. Yet reality often diverged from reports. Bribes, shortages, and simple exhaustion meant that records sometimes painted a rosier picture than life deserved. Still, the effort at accountability reveals how seriously the state regarded the frontier system. Though isolated, garrisons were not cut off from the world. Traders followed the wall, bringing goods from nearby towns. Salt was especially prized, as were tea bricks from the south. Cloth merchants offered sturdy fabric, while herbalists sold remedies for frostbite or fever. The keepers themselves sometimes bartered labor for goods. A day spent mending a merchant's cart could earn a family a jar of oil or a length of rope. In this way, the life of the wall was tied into broader regional economies. The frontier was harsh, but not entirely barren of human exchange. Life under the garrison system was not gentle. Desertion, theft of supplies, or neglect of duty could bring severe punishment. Records mention floggings, forced labor, or exile. In extreme cases, men who abandoned their posts during raids faced execution. Yet minor infractions were also common. Falling asleep on night watch, failing to maintain weapons, or neglecting repairs could all bring fines or lashings. For many keepers, the fear of punishment weighed as heavily as the labor itself. Despite the strict routines, keepers sought spiritual protection. Small temples and shrines dotted the frontier, dedicated to local gods, ancestors, or deities of war. Taoist priests sometimes visited, offering blessings, while Buddhist monks passed through with charms. But many rituals were simple and personal. A soldier might bury coins under a tower for luck, or carve protective characters into bricks. Some keepers even burned incense on the parapets, asking the wall itself to guard them. In lonely places, faith was another form of defense. So much of the Great Wall's legend is about its size and scale. Yet here, on the stones themselves, life was measured not in grandeur, but in small routines. A ledger balanced a drum sounded at dawn, a field of millet carefully weeded. These were not the deeds of emperors, but of keepers, whose work faded into obscurity even as the wall endured. What, then, truly holds up a monument? Is it the stone and mortar, or the countless hands that lived, labored, and sometimes died in its shadow? When you imagine the Great Wall now, you likely see stone ridges winding over distant hills, silent against the sky. But for the men who once kept it alive, silence was not the goal. Their duty was to fill it with presence, watchful eyes, steady hands, and the noise of tools on stone. Over time, that presence faded. The decline of the keepers was as gradual and as inevitable as the weather wearing down the wall itself. The Great Wall reached its strongest form during the Ming Dynasty, with garrisons bustling along its length. But as the 16th and 17th centuries wore on, the Ming faced growing pressures: piracy along the coast, corruption in the bureaucracy, and threats from the rising Manchu in the northeast. Funds that once kept the frontier supplied were redirected. Food shipments came less often, wages were delayed, and many keepers found themselves patching walls with inadequate tools. A wall can be built with effort, but without constant care, it slowly reverts to rubble. The same could be said of the system of men who lived upon it. With hunger came desertion. Records mention garrisons where half the men simply left, seeking better prospects in nearby villages or returning to their native provinces. Some took their families with them, others disappeared quietly into the night. Those who remained often bore double the burden. A single man might be responsible for a stretch of wall that once required several pairs of hands. Towers once meant to house full rotations of soldiers stood empty, their beacons unlit. The system strained until it cracked. Families who had built lives around the garrisons faced collapse as well. Markets dwindled, when traders stopped visiting. Fields went untended when men deserted. Women and children bore the brunt of shortages, sometimes scavenging wild plants or bartering scraps for grain. In some places, communities abandoned the frontier entirely. The wall, once alive with human activity, began to grow quiet. Empty watchtowers became shelters for owls, foxes, and shepherds passing through. When the Ming finally fell to the Manchu in the 17th century, the Great Wall lost its central purpose. The new Qing dynasty, ruling over both sides of the old frontier, had less need to maintain such a vast defense. Some garrisons remained active, but many were abandoned. The wall was no longer the dividing line of empires. It became, instead, a fading monument to an older struggle. The keepers who remained were fewer, often older men unable to return home, patching stones out of habit rather than state order. Without constant care, the elements advanced quickly. In the north, wind stripped away packed earth. In the mountains, snowmelt eroded foundations. Bricks were stolen by villagers to build homes. Mortar crumbled into dust. The keepers had once fought these small enemies with shovels, buckets, and patient labor. Now, with few men left to resist, the wall succumbed. Piece by piece, it returned to the soil from which it had been raised. Histories often record emperors who ordered the wall built, generals who fought upon it, and invaders who tested it. Rarely do they name the keepers, the men who mended a cracked stone in winter, or stood a sleepless night watch, or carried water up a steep ridge to mix fresh mortar. Yet their work was no less part of the wall than the bricks themselves. For centuries, they carried out lives of obscurity so that the wall might stand. Without them, its legend could not have lasted long enough to reach us now. When travelers walk the Great Wall, they often marvel at its scale. But much of what they see are restored sections, carefully rebuilt in modern times. The ruined stretches, crumbling in silence, speak more honestly of the centuries when keepers vanished and maintenance ended. To stand on those stones is to feel both presence and absence, the weight of thousands of forgotten lives, and the silence that followed when they were gone. Monuments are often credited to rulers, but their endurance depends on the unseen. The Great Wall was not held up by emperors, but by keepers, ordinary men bound by duty, habit, or survival. Their labor was tedious, their lives harsh, and their names lost. Yet for centuries, they were the difference between a ruin and a defense. As you imagine the wall now, stretching across mountains under the quiet sky, ask yourself, which is greater, the stone or the hands that kept it from falling? Picture a medieval monastery. You may think of stone cloisters, candlelit chapels, and monks chanting psalms. But hidden behind these spiritual routines was another world, the kitchen. For centuries, monasteries were sustained not just by prayer, but by the daily preparation of food. And though the kitchen was not a place of grandeur, it was a place of quiet order, where the rhythms of meals echoed the rhythms of devotion. The kitchen of a monastery was governed not by appetite, but by rule. Most medieval monasteries followed the rule of Saint Benedict, a set of guidelines written in the 6th century. It declared that monks should eat simply, avoid excess, and maintain discipline even at the table. Meals were usually taken in silence, accompanied by readings of scripture. The food itself was plain: bread, vegetables, beans, cheese, and occasionally fish. Meat from four-legged animals was often forbidden, though poultry and broth sometimes found their way onto the table in later centuries. Thus, the kitchen was not a place of indulgence, but of service, ensuring that the body was sustained, so that the spirit could endure in a large monastery. The kitchen was a low, smoky building attached to the cloister. Fireplaces burned day and night, with great blackened cauldrons hanging from iron hooks. Long tables bore knives, mortars, and pestles for grinding herbs. Wooden barrels held salt fish, dried peas, and grains. The smell was a mix of wood smoke, stewing cabbage, and baking bread. The kitchen was never silent. There was always the crackle of fire, the scrape of ladles, the murmur of prayer, and the shuffle of sandals across worn stone floors. It was not grand, but it was steady, and in its steadiness lay survival. Not all monks worked in the kitchen. Duties rotated. A monk might serve as cook for a week, then return to copying manuscripts or tending the garden. This rotation kept the burden from falling on a few and reminded all that humble service was a form of devotion. The cook was aided by assistants called kitchen brothers or lay. Brothers who performed heavy tasks like chopping wood, carrying water, and cleaning pots. Together, they formed a small community within the larger one, bound by smoke, fire, and the endless rhythm of preparing meals. The monastery kitchen depended on its garden. Rows of leeks, onions, cabbages, and beans grew within cloister walls. Herbs like sage, parsley, and thyme were carefully tended, not just for flavor, but for medicine. Bees provided honey, the only sweetener available in abundance. Beyond the garden, monasteries relied on storerooms. Barrels of salted fish arrived from rivers and coasts, while peasants paid rents in grain or cheese. Every ingredient carried the labor of others: farmers, fishermen, millers, and the kitchen turned those raw goods into meals that bound the community together. Life in a monastery followed a strict timetable, and the kitchen mirrored it. Monks rose in the dark for the first prayers, and by morning a light meal was prepared, often bread and ale. The main meal came at midday, with vegetables, legumes, and sometimes fish or eggs. A lighter supper followed before sunset. No matter how simple, each meal required hours of preparation. Fires had to be stoked, bread baked, and vegetables washed. Water was carried from wells, pots scrubbed with sand, floors swept of ash. The labor was endless, but also predictable in its repetition. The kitchen reflected the monastic life itself, steady, unchanging, and devoted to discipline. Though the kitchen was busy, it was not noisy in the worldly sense. Monks often kept silence, speaking only when necessary. Communication came through gestures, nods, or small signals. A cook might point to a pot, and another would stir. A hand raised toward the woodpile meant more fuel was needed. This quiet did not mean emptiness. It gave the work a meditative quality. To chop onions or stir a cauldron in silence was to practice patience, to treat even the smallest duty as part of a greater order. The monastery kitchen may seem dull compared to the library or the chapel, yet it was just as vital. Without its steady rhythms, no prayers could be sustained, no manuscripts copied, no cloister life preserved. When we think of the monastery today, do we remember the chanting monks or the cook, bent over a smoky fire, ladling cabbage soup into wooden bowls. The monastery kitchen, though steady in rhythm, was never entirely the same from season to season. Like the fields beyond the cloister walls, it followed the turning of the year. Fasting days and feast days, lean winters and fruitful harvests each brought its own challenges to the cooks and kitchen brothers. Within these changes, the monastery's devotion was tested, not only in prayer, but in patience, resourcefulness, and care for one another's survival. For much of the medieval year, the kitchen prepared meals without meat, dairy, or eggs. Lent, Advent, and countless other fast days filled the calendar. Some monasteries counted more than 200 days of fasting each year. On these days, meals grew plainer still. The kitchen produced broths of beans and cabbage, black bread made from rye or barley, and porridge of oats or millet. Oil replaced butter, and fish, when available, took the place of meat. Fasting was not only about abstaining from food, it was about humility, reminding monks that their bodies were not masters but servants. For the cooks, however, fasting meant inventiveness. They had to stretch limited ingredients into meals that nourished without indulgence. Winter was always the hardest season. By November, gardens lay empty, and the monastery relied on what it had stored. The kitchen thus became a place of careful foresight. Fish was salted or dried. Vegetables, like cabbage and turnips, were stored in pits of sand. Beans, peas, and lentils were dried for boiling in thick soups. Apples and pears were kept in cool cellars, while honey preserved nuts and berries. Herbs were tied in bundles and hung from rafters, their fragrance filling the smoky air. Without these stores, the monastery would face hunger, and so each summer and autumn, the kitchen worked in partnership with the garden and cellar, preparing not just for today's meal, but for months of survival ahead. Feast days and special preparations. Not every day was plain. Feast days, Christmas, Easter, the feast of a patron saint, brought richer meals. Then the kitchen bustled with unusual activity. Fresh fish might be purchased at great cost, poultry roasted, or wheels of cheese unwrapped after months of aging. Bread was made from fine wheat flour rather than rye, producing loaves lighter and whiter. Honey cakes or spiced puddings appeared on the table, flavored with precious cinnamon or cloves, imported through long trade routes. On these days, even the silence of the refectory was softened by the pleasure of abundance. Yet feast days were not frequent, and their contrast made the daily simplicity of monastery meals all the more striking. Bread and ale were the backbone of monastic diet. The kitchen and bakehouse worked hand in hand, grinding grain, kneading dough, and baking loaves in great clay ovens. The smell of baking bread, warm and yeasty, filled the cloister several times a week. Ale was brewed in large vats, often weaker than what you might imagine, more a nourishing drink than an intoxicant. It was safer than water, and so common that monks might consume several pints a day. The kitchen staff monitored brewing with care, balancing supplies of barley and hops to ensure steady production. Thus, bread and ale formed the steady heartbeat of the monastic table, though their meals were simple. Monastic cooks found quiet ways to vary them. A soup of beans might be flavored with onions and leeks, or thickened with barley. Herbs like thyme, sage, and parsley transformed plain broths. Vinegar added sharpness, honey a touch of sweetness. Even fasting dishes could be made comforting. Almond milk stood in for dairy, while fried cakes of peas or lentils offered texture and warmth. In their resourcefulness, the cooks mirrored the monastic spirit itself, finding depth in simplicity, meaning in repetition. Spring brought fresh greens, spinach, and herbs that broke the monotony of winter stores. Summer was a time of abundance: vegetables, berries, honey, and sometimes fresh fish from nearby rivers. Autumn meant harvest, grains threshed, apples gathered, beans dried for winter storage. Through each season, the kitchen's work shifted, but its purpose remained the same: to provide steady sustenance for prayer and labor. The turning of the year was felt most keenly not in the chapel, but in the quiet adjustments of the kitchen pot. The monastery kitchen was not a place of glory, but of endurance. Its work was hidden, repetitive, and often plain. Yet within its fires, the rhythm of the seasons was preserved, and the community sustained. When we think of medieval faith, we recall chants and stone towers. But might it be that the true measure of devotion was found in a pot of lentils simmering through a long winter's night? While the kitchen's first duty was to the monks within the cloister, its influence extended beyond stone walls. Hospitality and charity were central to monastic life, and both were carried on quietly and steadily through the kitchen's labors. In feeding the traveler, the stranger, and the poor, the monastery kitchen became a place where devotion turned into action. In most monasteries, a guest hall stood near the entrance, separate from the monks' quarters. Travelers arriving at dusk, pilgrims seeking shelter, or dignitaries visiting for business were received here. Tradition demanded that guests be welcomed as though they were Christ himself. The kitchen played its role by supplying meals. These were often richer than what the monks ate, especially for noble guests. Chickens might be roasted, finer bread set upon the table, and wine poured instead of ale. For pilgrims and common travelers, meals were simpler, but always offered freely: soup, bread, and drink enough to restore strength for the road. The monks themselves did not break their silence at table, but guests dined in conversation, sometimes with a brother present to read aloud or offer guidance. In this way, the monastery's hospitality was carried both in food and in the atmosphere of peace. Beyond hospitality for guests, the kitchen also maintained daily charity. At the monastery gate, alms were given: loaves of bread, bowls of porridge, sometimes small fish or vegetables. For the poor in nearby villages, the monastery was a lifeline, especially in harsh winters or years of famine. The kitchen managed this duty carefully. Leftover bread from the refectory was not wasted but distributed. Surplus from gardens and fields found its way to the poor rather than being hoarded. In times of plenty, the monastery might feed dozens at its gate each day. In times of scarcity, the kitchen stretched its stores thin to ensure some measure of charity remained. This quiet giving was rarely recorded, yet it was one of the monastery's most enduring works, though its meals were plain. The kitchen embodied lessons the monks carried into their spiritual lives. Patience in stirring a pot mirrored patience in prayer. Frugality in using scraps reflected humility before God. Hospitality to the stranger echoed the call to see. Christ in all. Young novices, assigned to kitchen duty, often found the work tedious at first, but over months of chopping, stirring, and sweeping, they came to see the spiritual rhythm hidden in repetition. The monastery taught not through lectures alone, but through labor, and the kitchen was its most constant classroom centuries past. Yet the monastery kitchen changed little. Recipes were handed down from cook to cook, not written, but remembered. A broth flavored with leeks, a honey cake baked for Easter, ale brewed with a particular strain of hops each, was a thread in the fabric of tradition. Even today, in some monasteries, still active, echoes of these meals remain. Bread is baked in wood-fired ovens, herbs are gathered from cloister gardens, and guests are welcomed with simple but generous tables. The continuity is striking, a living link between the medieval world and our own. When we picture medieval monasteries, we think of illuminated manuscripts, chanting in candlelit choirs, or towers rising against the sky. Yet, beneath all of this, the kitchen quietly sustained everything. Without bread and broth, prayer would falter. Without charity from the kitchen door, villages might starve. Without hospitality, pilgrims would lose heart on their journeys. The legacy of the monastery kitchen is not found in grand cathedrals, but in the memory of countless humble meals, shared without pride, given without condition. The monastery kitchen was not a place of noise or drama. Its fires burned low, its meals were plain, and its work was often invisible. But in its silence, it embodied the essence of monastic life: constancy, humility, and care for others. Perhaps, in its very ordinariness, it left the truest mark. For in every pot of lentil soup, every loaf of black bread, every portion shared with the poor, the kitchen testified that devotion is not only sung in choirs or carved in stone. It is also simmered, stirred, and quietly served. When you think of the ancient world, you might imagine grand temples, kings, or bustling marketplaces. But hidden behind those scenes was a quieter figure, the scribe. He sat hunched over a desk or a low bench, with brush, stylus, or reed pen in hand, copying lines of text for hours, days, and even years at a time. His work was not dramatic, nor was it celebrated with statues or songs. Yet it was essential. Without scribes, the knowledge of empires, the prayers of priests, and the contracts of merchants would have faded into silence. Picture a room, dimly lit, perhaps by narrow slits for windows or by a flickering oil lamp. The air smells faintly of ink thick and dark, often made from soot mixed with gum and water. Reeds or brushes lie ready in a jar, trimmed to fine points for precise strokes. A stack of papyrus sheets or clay tablets waits nearby. The surface before the scribe is often plain, a simple board, sometimes cushioned by cloth to steady the hand. In Egypt, scribes worked with papyrus rolls, carefully unrolling one section at a time. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets were pressed with wedge-shaped marks using a stylus. In Greece and Rome, parchment or wax tablets carried the letters, copied over and over until the hand cramped. The room was not silent. Other scribes might sit in rows, scratching away at their own copies. Sometimes a reader dictated aloud while they wrote in unison, though more often the work was solitary. The faint sound of pens against papyrus or stylus on clay filled the air. Scribes kept strict schedules. In some temples or administrative offices, their day began at dawn with prayers or rituals, followed by a long stretch of copying. Breaks were minimal, often only for meals of bread, lentils, or beer. A scribe might copy religious hymns in the morning, then tax records in the afternoon, followed by lists of goods, contracts, or legal decrees. This rhythm could last from youth into old age. Apprentices began training as boys, first learning the basic shapes of letters and numbers. Endless drills filled their early years, writing the same signs over and over until their hands obeyed the mind's memory. Only after years of practice could they copy full texts without error. The work left its marks. Scribes sat in rigid postures for hours, straining their eyes on small details. Their hands cramped, shoulders stiffened, and backs ached from bending forward. In some manuscripts, you can still find marginal notes where a weary scribe sighed his complaint, "The work is hard," or "Writing is a great labor." Errors crept in easily when the mind wandered or the light grew dim. A skipped line, a doubled phrase, a misread word, these mistakes could not always be erased. Some were corrected with careful scraping of parchment or resoftening of clay, but others remained, leaving future readers puzzled. And yet, despite these frustrations, the scribes endured. Their task was less about personal comfort and more about duty to the temple, the state, the patron, or to knowledge itself. Each culture shaped the work of its scribes through the tools it provided. Egyptian scribes used reed pens cut at sharp angles, dipped into ink made of soot or ochre. Their papyrus sheets, pressed from reeds along the Nile, offered a smooth but fragile surface. Mesopotamian scribes pressed triangular wedges into clay, their styluses often made of reed or bone. The baked tablets could last for millennia, though at the time they were simply records of grain deliveries or debt repayments. In Greece and Rome, parchment and wax tablets made the task portable. A scribe could smooth the wax and begin again. But parchment demanded precision. Errors stood out clearly, and the cost of materials made waste intolerable. Every sheet was precious. The tools shaped not only the act of writing, but the endurance of the text. Some of what scribes wrote was forgotten within years, destroyed or discarded. Other works, like Homer's poems, biblical scriptures, or Roman law codes, survived precisely because scribes kept copying them generation after generation. It is easy to ask, why did they keep going? What kept a man at his desk when his eyes blurred and his fingers cramped? The answer was partly practical. Being a scribe was one of the few paths to education, respect, and steady work. In Egypt, scribes enjoyed higher status than farmers or laborers. In Mesopotamia, they served kings and priests, trusted with the written record of empire. In Greece and Rome, scribes ensured that literature and law reached posterity. But beyond status and livelihood, there was something else. Scribes believed their work preserved memory itself. To copy a hymn was to keep the gods honored. To copy a contract was to guard justice. To copy a poem was to grant it new life. In their own words, they sometimes admitted weariness, but they also hinted at pride. A text once written might outlast even the stone of a temple. And so they endured. The world of the scribe was a world of monotony, discipline, and patience. To sit hour after hour, day after day, writing lines that were not one's own. This required a strange mix of humility and determination. Yet, without such endurance, vast portions of human history would have been lost. Still, one wonders, as a scribe dipped his pen into ink for the 100th time that morning, did he ever stop to ask himself whether the words he copied would truly matter, or whether he was merely filling space on a fragile page? The endurance of scribes was not only a matter of physical persistence. It was also cultivated by years of training and the quiet reinforcement of their role in society. To understand how these men and occasionally women kept their ink flowing, we must step into the schools where their work began, and then trace how their place in the social order gave meaning, or at least stability, to their endless copying in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Scribal training began in what were often called tablet houses, or schools attached to temples and administrative centers. Children of scribal families or promising youths selected for their aptitude entered around age 7 or 8. Their days were filled with repetition. In Mesopotamia, the young student began with simple wedge marks pressed into clay. He would copy the same sign over and over 100 times until his stylus formed the shape without hesitation. Only then would he move on to basic words: grain, king, god, temple. Clay tablets survive with columns of identical words written by nervous apprentices, the signs growing more confident down the page. Egyptian novices practiced with reed pens on fragments of broken pottery, called asr. Their early exercises often consisted of proverbs or moral sayings: do not be idle, or a scribe's tongue is his weapon. The lessons trained not only the hand but also the mind, reminding the student of the dignity and duty of his future role. Greek and Roman education followed a similar pattern. Students learned their letters first, chanting them aloud, then practiced copying short passages. Eventually, they graduated to longer texts, speeches of Demosthenes, verses of Homer, or laws of the 12 tables. By mastering both letters and content, the scribe became both a technician and a transmitter of culture. A remarkable part of this training involved memorization. To reduce errors, students were expected to memorize large sections of text before copying them. This method meant that a scribe did not simply transcribe, but often recited lines internally while writing. Imagine the mental effort. Not only must the hand move with precision, but the mind must keep pace, storing a string of words long enough to lay them down accurately. Errors of memory were as dangerous as slips of the pen, and teachers were quick to scold. Surviving school texts show corrections written by a teacher's hand, sometimes with a sharp note: you are lazy, or pay attention. The path was not easy. Ancient records hint at punishments for inattentive students. A Mesopotamian text lists the complaints of a schoolboy: the teacher struck me, my hand was beaten, my back was sore. Another notes that students feared not only errors in writing, but also lapses in etiquette, arriving late, failing to bow, or speaking out of turn. This strict discipline produced scribes who could endure long hours of tedium without complaint, or at least without open rebellion. It conditioned them for the unyielding rhythm of adult scribal life. The reward for such endurance was not wealth but status. In Egypt, scribes stood above the farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who made up the majority of society. Official texts praised the scribal life, contrasting it with the hardships of manual labor. The scribe's hand does not blister. His body is not bent beneath the plow. Though the reality was long hours of copying, the scribe did enjoy privileges. He was literate in a largely illiterate world, and this gave him access to power. In Mesopotamia, scribes served kings, priests, and merchants. They recorded offerings to temples, treaties between rulers, and trade accounts that stretched across empires. Their role was essential, even if their names were forgotten. For every great inscription carved into stone by order of a king, dozens of clay tablets filled with routine entries: wheat, sheep, silver. Taxes were written by anonymous scribes. In Greece and Rome, scribes held a mixed place. Some were slaves trained for secretarial work, copying documents for their masters. Others were freedmen or professionals, earning a living by selling copies of books or recording legal proceedings. The work could bring modest income, but its true importance lay in how it sustained the circulation of ideas. Without scribes, literature would have remained trapped in the mouths of poets. The life of a scribe, though respected, was rarely glamorous. Complaints survived in marginal notes: "My hand is weary," or "This parchment is bad." Some even left small jokes or doodles between the lines, reminders that behind the neat script was a tired human being. Yet there were joys as well. To handle books, to copy words of wisdom or beauty, was itself a privilege. A scribe might find comfort in the thought that his work would outlast him. Even a humble clerk who copied tax receipts contributed to the memory of his community. Some scribes became attached to particular texts, repeatedly copying a favorite poem or hymn. They knew it nearly by heart, perhaps whispering lines as they worked. The monotony of the task blurred into a rhythm that could be almost meditative. Despite training, errors remained a constant threat. A single slip of the pen might change a word's meaning entirely. To avoid this, scribes developed habits: counting lines, marking sections, or reading aloud as they wrote. Still, mistakes crept in. Some were corrected, others passed unnoticed, shaping the text for future readers. This fragility raises an interesting question. How much of what we call ancient wisdom is, in fact, the product of scribal endurance or scribal error? Each copy was a survival, but also a transformation. Training, discipline, and social standing all helped scribes endure their profession. Their labor was not simply tolerated, but woven into the structure of society itself. Yet, beneath the praise of their role and the respect of their education lay the daily reality: aching hands, long hours, and the hum of endless repetition. One cannot help but wonder, when a scribe finished a day's work and set down his pen, did he feel pride in preserving a fragment of eternity, or only relief that, for a few hours at least, the copying was done? The endurance of the scribe did not end with his own lifetime. His labors, multiplied by thousands of hands over centuries, became the scaffolding upon which cultural memory was built. Each copied tablet, each scroll or parchment, each wax tablet, smoothed and written anew, contributed not merely to record keeping, but to the survival of thought itself. Consider how a text lived in the ancient world. A clay tablet might last for decades, perhaps centuries, but the words on it could only survive if another hand impressed them into new clay. A papyrus scroll, fragile and prone to decay, might crumble after a century, unless someone painstakingly recopied it onto fresh sheets. Knowledge was not preserved by permanence, but by renewal. Every generation of scribes became a bridge between past and future. To break that chain was to allow a text to vanish. Countless works did disappear: hymns, epics, medical treatises, and practical manuals that were never recopied. What remains to us is a fraction of what once existed, chosen not by deliberate design, but by the persistence of scribes who deemed certain works worth their time. Scribes rarely wrote original compositions. Their names are seldom attached to the texts they preserved. Yet their choices shaped the cultural record. Which epics of Mesopotamia survived? Which hymns of Egypt still whisper through tomb walls? Which plays of Greece and Rome were handed down? Behind each survival lies a scribe who, faced with limited time and materials, decided what to copy. Sometimes it was a patron who chose, ordering Homer copied again, or dictating which legal codes were to be maintained. But sometimes the decision was practical or personal. A teacher selecting school texts, a monastery preserving the Psalms, a clerk reusing a parchment for what seemed important in the moment. Thus, while the scribe may not have intended to be an editor of history, in effect he was. The world we know is filtered through his endurance. A scribe's career might last decades. In his youth, he wrote swiftly and with vigor. In middle age, his script was steady but cautious, less prone to flourish. In old age, his hand sometimes trembled. Letters grew uneven, and errors crept in. A few such manuscripts survive, where the fading energy of the hand tells its own story. These aging scribes often became teachers, guiding new apprentices in the art of letters. They passed down not only technique, but also the mindset of persistence, the ability to continue even when the task seemed endless, even when eyes blurred and hands grew numb. To live as a scribe was to accept that most of one's life would be spent repeating words that were not one's own. It was a life of service to memory. Not all endurance led to perfection. Sometimes scribes introduced mistakes that reshaped history. A misread word might alter a law. A skipped line might change a story. In religious texts, these errors could carry profound consequences, shifting doctrine or inspiring debate. And yet, in other cases, mistakes enriched tradition. Marginal notes grew into commentary. Clarifications scribbled between lines became part of the text. Even doodle-steiny drawings of faces, animals, or playful figures give us insight into the human side of scribes. Long after their names are forgotten, their endurance was not flawless, but it was fertile. Through both their precision and their imperfections, scribes left us a more complex inheritance. The paradox of scribal work lies in its fragility and resilience. A single library fire could erase hundreds of texts. A lost scroll meant a voice silenced forever. And yet, because scribes copied and recopied, certain works became nearly indestructible. Homer's epics endured, not because papyrus was eternal, but because scribes never ceased to copy them. Biblical texts survived not because parchment was unyielding, but because generations of monks treasured them enough to rewrite them again and again. Roman law codes, Confucian classics, Indian sutras all survived through sheer scribal persistence. Each copied word was an act of faith that memory mattered. The scribes themselves, so essential, often faded into obscurity. Few of their names are remembered. A rare colophantha, short note at the end of a manuscript sometimes records a scribe's identity or even his feelings. I wrote this, though my hand was sore. These glimpses remind us that behind every grand tradition of literature or law, there was an individual, weary and persistent. Ironically, while they preserved the words of others for eternity, their own words vanished into silence. Their legacy is not their voices, but the survival of others' voices. The endurance of ancient scribes was not dramatic. It was slow, monotonous, often thankless. Yet their persistence was civilization's safeguard. Each line of text, each careful stroke, was a refusal to let memory die. As you picture a scribe dipping his pen once more, shoulders aching, eyes straining in the dim light, consider what he was truly preserving. Not just ink on papyrus, but the fragile thread of continuity that connects us to the ancient world. Without him, our histories would be silence. If the daily rhythm of a Viking farm was dictated by the seasons, then the tools and buildings of the farmstead were the stage on which that rhythm played out. These were not glamorous, nor were they built for beauty. They were made for endurance, economy, and the quiet repetition of tasks. The longhouse was the defining feature of a Viking farm, ranging from 15 to over 70 meters long. It was a multi-purpose structure that blurred the boundaries between living space, workshop, and barn. The walls were made of timber planks or wattle and daub woven branches plastered with clay and dung. Roofs were steep, thatched with turf or straw, and heavy timbers supported the ridge. Inside, there was no chimney. Instead, smoke from the central hearth rose and filtered out through gaps in the roof, leaving the air hazy and the rafters soot-black. Animals often lived in one section of the house, separated by a low wooden partition. Their body heat helped warm the room, though at the cost of smell and noise. Imagine trying to sleep with the steady shifting of cows or the occasional bleating of goats. Benches lined the walls, doubling as seating by day and sleeping platforms by night. Furs softened the rough wood, but comfort was minimal. Light came from small slits or from oil lamps carved of stone, fueled by fish oil or tallow. The longhouse was not a place of solitude, was crowded, smoky, and alive with the sounds of both humans and animals. Surrounding the longhouse were smaller structures, each with a narrow function. Granaries, raised on posts to keep out damp and vermin, held sacks of barley and rye. Sheds housed tools. Smokehouses preserved meat. Byres and pens kept sheep, goats, and pigs. Even in these secondary structures, practicality ruled. Timber was valuable, so buildings were small and often rebuilt when they rotted. Roofs sagged under snow in winter and leaked in storms. Farmers constantly patched, propped, and mended their structures, just as they did their lives. The Viking farmer's toolkit was not vast, but it was indispensable. Iron was costly, so tools were often repaired and reused for generations. Wooden handles and bone fittings were common, while iron was reserved for the working edge. Plows, ard plows, Wooden frames tipped with iron, pulled by oxen, scratched shallow furrows into the soil. They did not turn the earth as modern plows do, leaving fields dependent on hand labor for finishing. Sickles and scythes, essential for cutting grass, barley, or reeds. The curved sickle was for smaller harvests, while the long scythe cut swaths of hay in summer meadows. Axes, ubiquitous, used not only for chopping wood, but also as multi-purpose tools for construction, butchery, and even combat if needed. Corn's hand mills, heavy stones used to grind grain into flour, worked by hand with endless circular motions, often by women. This was backbreaking, repetitive labor that filled hours each day. Knives, every household had them, from large cutting knives to small utility blades. For textiles, women relied on looms set upright against the walls. Spinning was done with simple whorls, small stone or clay weights fixed on spindles. These tools were basic, yet they produced the clothing, sails, and ropes that held Viking society together. Textiles on a Viking farm were not decorative luxuries, they were necessities. Wool was the most important fiber, coming from sheep that dotted the hillsides. Women cleaned, carded, spun, and wove it into cloth. This was slow, constant work. One tunic could take weeks or months to produce. Linen came from flax, which required careful processing, soaking in water, beating, and combing before spinning. Linen provided cooler clothing in summer, though wool dominated in the long winters. The clothes themselves were practical. Men wore tunics belted at the waist, trousers tied at the ankle, and cloaks fastened with simple brooches. Women wore long dresses with an overdress, fastened with distinctive oval brooches at the shoulders. Shoes were leather, stitched together with plant fibers or sinew. Colors were usually muted, browns, grays, faded greens. Bright dyes existed, but they were costly or required trade. On most farms, clothing was plain, durable, and patched repeatedly before being replaced. The hearth was the heart of the longhouse, and it was rarely allowed to go out. Fuel came from firewood or dried peat, though both could be scarce in some regions. The fire provided heat, light, and the means to cook food, but it also filled the house with smoke. Cooking was done in iron cauldrons or clay pots, suspended above the fire or nestled in embers. Meals were typically one-pot affairs, stews of barley, root vegetables, and occasional meat. Bread was baked on flat stones or in clay ovens, when available, for flavor. Farms relied on herbs, dill, mustard seed, wild onions. Salt was precious, used mainly for preservation. The taste of most meals would have been earthy, plain, and repetitive. What strikes us about Viking farm life is not the drama of invention, but the persistence of tradition. Their tools were simple, their houses rough, but they worked. The slow grind of the corn, the steady swinging of the scythe, the smoke curling from turf roofs, these were the rhythms of a world where survival meant making do. There was no escape from the cycle of mending, patching, and repeating. To live as a Viking farmer was not to chase novelty, but to endure sameness. Year after year, the same tools, the same hearth, the same tasks. It was boring by design, because boredom was another word for stability, and stability meant survival. When most people think of Vikings, they imagine raids across the sea, horned helmets which they never wore, and warriors shouting from dragon-proud ships. But for the majority of Scandinavians in the Viking Age, life was not lived with swords and sails. It was lived on farms, and those farms were not grand halls filled with feasts every night. They were muddy, drafty, and demanding places where survival meant long hours of labor. If raiding and trading were the face of Viking culture abroad, farming was its backbone at home. A typical Viking farm was a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by fields, pastures, and, beyond them, forests or fjords. The longhouse, built of timber and turf, stood at the center. It was not just a family dwelling, but the hub of the entire farm. People, animals, food storage, and social gatherings all mixed under one roof. Smoke from a central hearth blackened the rafters. The floor was strewn with straw to soften the mud. In winter, cows and goats were sometimes brought inside for warmth, adding their smell to the smoky air. Privacy was scarce, noise constant. The surrounding land was divided into strips, barley and rye in the fields, hay meadows for fodder, and patches of flax or turnips. Farmers also relied on nearby woods for timber, firewood, and wild foods. The rhythm of Viking farm life was set by the seasons. Spring meant plowing and sowing. Summer brought haymaking and fishing. Autumn required harvest and slaughter. And winter was a time of repair, weaving, and survival. In spring, oxen pulled wooden plows through fields, breaking soil that had to be cleared of rocks by hand. Men worked the heavy tools, while women and children planted seeds in the FURROWS. Summer was consumed by the hay harvest. Grass was cut with scythes, left to dry, and then gathered into stacks. Without enough hay, animals could not survive the winter. So this work was literally a matter of life or death. Autumn meant long days of gathering crops and preparing for the cold. Barley was stored for bread and beer, rye for porridge, flax for linen. Animals not needed for breeding were slaughtered, their meat salted or smoked. Winter meals depended on these stores, and a failed harvest meant hunger. Winter slowed the pace, but did not bring rest. Snow had to be cleared, tools mended, and clothing woven. Women spun wool into yarn and wove it into cloth, while men carved wood or repaired boats. Even in the darkest months, work never ceased. The Viking diet was simple, shaped by the farm. Bread made from barley or rye, porridge flavored with dried berries, and broth thickened with root vegetables formed the staples. Meat was eaten but sparingly, except in the weeks after slaughter, when fresh supplies were abundant. Fish, both fresh and dried, filled the gap. Dairy was vital. Cows, sheep, and goats provided milk that was churned into butter or fermented into sour milk. Cheese, which kept well, was a common food. Honey was the main sweetener, and beer brewed from barley was safer to drink than water. Feasts, with roasted meat and imported wine, were rare luxuries, reserved for weddings, alliances, or celebrations of successful voyages. The average day on a Viking farm involved meals that were filling but rarely exciting. Every member of the household worked. Men were responsible for heavy labor in the fields, woodcutting, and construction. Women managed the household economy, tending to dairy, preserving food, weaving, and overseeing servants or thralls if the family owned them. Children began helping from an early age, gathering firewood, tending animals, scaring birds from the fields. Elderly members, though less able to work, contributed by spinning, storytelling, or watching younger children. Thralls or slaves formed the lowest tier. Captured in raids or bought through trade, they did the hardest, dirtiest work. While some could eventually earn freedom, most lived lives of quiet toil, almost invisible in the records. To live on a Viking farm was to live with constant labor and constant uncertainty. A storm could destroy crops, a harsh winter could kill animals, and illness could sweep through a household. Yet this life was the norm. Only a fraction of men ever went raiding. Most were tied to their land, their animals, their families. The daily grind of sowing, mowing, milking, and mending was the unseen reality that sustained Viking culture. Without these farms, there would have been no warriors, no ships, and no sagas. The truth is both boring and quietly remarkable. Behind every Viking raid was a farmstead that kept people fed, clothed, and alive. If the longhouse was the physical center of a Viking farm, then faith and community were its invisible scaffolding. Survival was not only about tools, crops, and livestock, but also about cooperation, tradition, and the belief that unseen forces, both human and divine, shaped the outcome of every harvest. No Viking farm was an island. Even the most self-reliant household depended on the networks of kin and neighbors that surrounded it. Kinship bound families together in webs of responsibility. A brother might help repair a roof, while a cousin might loan a cow in times of scarcity. Feasting and gift-giving reinforced these ties. A farmer who slaughtered an extra sheep might invite neighbors to share the meat, expecting help in return during haymaking. Debt was rarely measured in coin. It was tallied in favors, work, and future promises. The thing, or local assembly, was the venue where disputes were aired and settled. Property lines, grazing rights, and obligations were negotiated there. For farmers, this meant hours of dull waiting and listening as free men argued over boundaries and payments. Yet the thing was essential. It kept the fragile balance of rural society from collapsing into feud. Before Christianity spread, most Viking farmers lived in a world shaped by Norse paganism. Gods like Freyr, associated with fertility and harvest, were especially important to rural life. Offerings might be made at a small shrine in the home or in outdoor spaces marked by stones or wooden idols. Farmers sacrificed animals, often pigs or cattle, at seasonal festivals, with the meat divided among participants. These rituals were not extravagant but practical, reinforcing community bonds, while appealing to divine forces for good weather and fertile fields. After Christianity arrived, the rhythms shifted but did not entirely disappear. By the 11th century, many farms had small wooden churches nearby, and Sunday worship became part of rural life. Still, old customs lingered, especially in remote valleys, where traditions of ancestor veneration and seasonal rites continued quietly while men tended livestock, plowed, or hunted. Women's labor sustained the inner life of the farm. They were responsible for food preparation, textile production, and household management. Their work was endless, grinding grain, milking cows, churning butter, spinning wool, and weaving. Children, too, were folded into this system from an early age. They herded sheep, gathered firewood, and learned practical skills by imitation. Childhood was brief, by adolescents. Most were already full contributors to the household economy, though the word Viking evokes images of raiding ships. The majority of farmers rarely ventured on long voyages. Still, the sea was never far away. Fishing supplemented diets with herring, cod, or salmon, and coastal farms often dried or salted fish for trade. Some families combined farming with seasonal expeditions. Men might leave in summer to trade or raid, while women and elders managed the fields. This dual economy blurred the line between the adventurous world of longships and the slow routines of farming. One could imagine a man returning from abroad with silver or spices, only to spend the autumn repairing fences and stacking hay. Perhaps the greatest test of Viking farm life was winter. With daylight dwindling and snow covering the fields, survival depended on the stores laid up during the summer. Grain bins, meat hung in smokehouses, and cheese stored in cool pits were measured out carefully. The longhouse became a closed world. Fires burned low to conserve fuel. Work shifted to indoor tasks: weaving, tool repair, carving. Storytelling filled the evenings as sagas and family histories passed from mouth to ear. These tales were not simply entertainment, they were cultural anchors, reminders of identity and endurance. Winter was monotonous, dark, and isolating, but it also underscored the collective achievement of survival. Each meal eaten in January was a testament to the hay cut in July, the sheep tended in August, and the fish dried in September. Those sagas praise warriors and kings. It was farms that sustained the Viking world. Every shipbuilder, raider, or trader was the son of a farmer, fed on porridge and bread made in smoke-darkened longhouses. Every chieftain's wealth was measured in land, livestock, and the loyalty of the farming families who worked them in truth. Most Vikings were not seafaring adventurers, but peasants who rarely traveled far from their valleys. Their world was bounded by fences, fields, and weather. Yet it was their steady labor, the sowing, harvesting, mending, and enduring, that gave the Viking Age its foundation. Without the boring constancy of farm life, the drama of raids and voyages would have been impossible. To imagine the life of a Viking farmer is to set aside the glamour of horned helmets and battlefield glory, and instead to hear the slow creak of a cornstone, the hiss of a peat fire, and the sigh of animals shifting in the dark of a longhouse. It is to realize that survival was achieved not in moments of heroism, but in the repetition of chores, the patience of endurance, and the resilience of ordinary people. Their lives may appear monotonous to us, yet it was precisely that monotony that carried families through harsh winters and uncertain harvests. And so we might ask, in an age that prizes novelty and change, what lessons remain in the Viking farmer's quiet mastery of repetition and survival? And so, we reach the end of this journey through the quieter corners of history, a world of steady work, forgotten names, and lives lived at a slower pace. The details may have been small, but they were the threads that wove the fabric of the past as the candle burns low, and the voices of history fade into silence. You can let go of the day and drift into rest. Tomorrow will bring new stories, but for now, it is enough to simply sleep good night.